Hold out your hand and imagine you are holding in your palm a silk slipper. So tiny, it looks like it's made for a doll. And now imagine that this miniature shoe actually fit onto an adult woman's foot. How is that possible? It is possible through the use of Chinese footbinding. That is how. A cultural practice that for about 1,000 years reshaped not only the bones of millions of women's feet, but also Chinese society itself. So today, we will go through the story of Chinese footbinding, from its mysterious origins and rise in imperial China, all the way to its place as a status symbol and even a kind of ideal of beauty, and also the painful techniques and daily realities behind the so-called glamour of the golden lotus foot. A bit of a macabre topic, I know, but it's part of modern history that doesn't often get mentioned. So here I am, mentioning it. Well, let me welcome you to the channel first. Pleasure to have you with me today. Back to doing some Chinese history, and yes, it fits somewhat within the classification of modern history. We end our story pretty much when the Qing dynasty ends. Now, for anyone new to the channel, I'd like to welcome you. If you've not clicked the subscribe button yet, I invite you to do so. And you will notice that this video is 100% ad-free. Now, that is due to the generous contributions of those who chose to donate, those on the Patreon, YouTube memberships, and those even out of curiosity who took the time to check out the merch store. You have my thanks for all your support. If you want to become a part of that prestigious group, you can find where you need to go in the pinned comment or the description. Everything's all there. Now, without further ado and the introductions out of the way, let us get on to the topic for today. Of course, as we begin, we're faced with a bit of a problem, because the true origin of the practice is somewhat shrouded in legend. There is a popular story, though, that reaches to the 10th century in the Chinese court of the southern Tang kingdom. Emperor Li Yu, as the tale goes, became enamored with a court dancer named Yao Niang, who actually bound her feet with white silk into the shape of a crescent moon. Yao Niang performed a mesmerizing dance on tiptoe atop a 6-foot-tall golden lotus pedestal. With each step, she seemed to skim the petals of that lotus, her tiny feet moving so gracefully that, quote, lotus blossoms sprang from her every footfall. That is, at least, according to the myth. Now the emperor was so captivated by her dainty curved feet and the ethereal dance that other court ladies began to emulate her too, binding their own feet to win favor and recreate that enchanting moment. Whether or not Yao Niang herself truly existed, this legend does show the symbolic start of footbinding as an aesthetic court fashion, one that's born from a mix of artistry, sensuality, and imperial whim, I suppose. But there are other origin tales too, and they also credit an imperial consort. For instance, an older legend claims an emperor in the 6th century had a beloved concubine with naturally small and arched feet, which inspired imitation. But historical evidence for footbinding becomes solid only later. The earliest known mention comes from the 12th century in written form. The scholar Zhang Bangjie noted that women's footbinding began in recent times. It was not mentioned in any books from previous eras. Now, that is him writing in the 12th century. So that implies that the custom was new within his living memory. And it tells us that by the Song Dynasty, 960 to 1279, footbinding was certainly known, yet it hadn't existed, or at least hadn't been documented in ancient Chinese classic texts. Indeed, archaeologists have confirmed that no earlier skeletons show bound feet. Of course, it's very easy to get archaeological evidence for that. We find a female corpse buried underground, of the skeleton of one, and of course the bones on the feet would be arranged in that typical manner. Now, the earliest physical evidence of bound feet comes from the 13th century. Prime example of that. A noblewoman's tomb contained tiny shoes and the skeletal remains of misshapen feet with bent toes and an exaggerated arch, indicating, of course, the binding process. It's the most clear evidence that we can have, and it actually helps quite a lot with dating and identifying the time periods of remains being found underground. Thus, we do believe, right now at least from our evidence, that footbinding first arose in the 5 dynasties and Song period, and that's likely around the 900 to 1000 CE in China's south, and from there it spread culturally among the court dancers and high-born ladies. But it's probably a bit confusing, isn't it? Because why exactly did this practice catch on? Apart from all the myths and fables, things like that, that kind of romanticize it, it seems to be quite a, well, frankly, painful practice. So why exactly was it gaining popularity? Well, from what we know, it initially seems to have been a status symbol, and even an erotic fashion among the elite. In a refined society that prized delicate and small-boned feminine beauty, a tiny foot became the ultimate hallmark of grace. A small foot also suggested that the woman didn't need to perform heavy manual labor, which is, of course, an aristocratic privilege. By the Song Dynasty, footbinding was becoming widespread in aristocratic and well-to-do circles. Now, before we move on, I'll just mention quickly a little bit of a modern Chinese practice. It's going away a little bit now, but it's still there. You can spot it if you look close enough. And when we talk about the exclusion from manual labor, there's a few ways that people like to express this. Now, among the men, there is an old practice that's still quite alive, and that is letting the pinky finger's nail grow quite long, and of course keeping it as clean as possible, all that sort of thing. Now, of course, this is to express that somebody has a inside job, or they're quite well-to-do, that kind of thing. Of course, if you're going to be digging trenches or working on the farm, you're not, well, that little pinky finger's nail is not going to last for too long, let alone be kept clean. So a lot of people still do that to express some kind of form of wealth, which is quite ironic because it's never the rich people in China who do it. It's only the poor people who do it to try to convince others. Maybe they try and convince themselves, I'm not sure. But gradually that process is going away. Now, back to our main talk. I do apologize for going off on a bit of a tangent. What about the poets? Well, those of the era began to celebrate the allure of bound feet in their verses, comparing a woman's small feet to new moons or even lotus flower buds. Over the subsequent centuries, what started as a courtly trend evolved into a deeply entrenched cultural norm. The practice spread from the imperial court to the scholar official class, and then gradually to merchants, landowners, and eventually permeated even the peasantry in many regions. And so by the Qing dynasty, that is 1644 to 1912, foot binding was nearly ubiquitous among Han Chinese women, not just of the upper classes, but of all social strata, from the richest city courtesans to the wives of poor farmers, especially in northeastern and central China. Now, I will say, some regions, let's say like in the southwest, like Yunnan, they did not practice it too much. Perhaps only the upper classes, but the normal women were out there working in the fields with the men. Of course, you couldn't have bound feet when you were doing that. But either way, it's estimated that by the 19th century, over 40% of all Chinese women had bound feet. And in some communities, almost every girl had her feet bound, except those in the most impoverished families. Of course, the most impoverished families would need as many work hands as they could. But it is important to note that foot binding was not practiced by everyone. Now, we've mentioned Yunnan quite briefly, but we'll also mention the Manchus. Now, they ruled China during the Qing dynasty, and they explicitly forbade foot binding among Manchu women. Manchu empresses and banner women instead wore platform shoes, sometimes with curved soles to simulate a mincing gait, but their feet were left natural. Early in his reign, the Qing Emperor Kangxi tried to ban foot binding for all subjects, partly seeing it as an undesirable Han Chinese custom, Han being, of course, the minority group in China. But the ban failed due to popular resistance, and eventually they had no choice but to rescind it. Frontier peoples like the Mongols, Tibetans, and others generally did not bind women's feet either. There were a few instances, mainly among the upper class, trying to replicate some of the other court ladies, but for the most part they were not doing it. And within Han society, there were also regional and class variations. In some poorer areas among groups like the Hakka in southern China, women remained natural-footed because families needed them to work out there with them or because of different cultural norms in general. But still, for the majority of Han Chinese communities over centuries, a bound foot became a nearly indispensable mark of not only femininity but social propriety. But why exactly did this practice persist for so long? Well, if you want to know that, you've got to have a look into traditional Chinese culture. In a word, bound feet were idealized as the epitome of female beauty and refinement. I know it sounds a little bit strange, but stay with me. We'll get to the point. You see, a well-bound foot was likened to a golden lotus. In Chinese, they call it san cun jin lian, lian being the word for lotus, okay, like the flower. Now, this kind of poetic term, right, most poetic, they call them chengyu, right, these 4 character terms in Chinese. It encapsulates this aesthetic. The foot about 3 inches long with a high arch and the toes tucked under. It actually quite resembles the flower bud of a lotus. 3 inches, around 7 to 8 centimeters, was the dream called the golden lotus foot. And a girl who achieved that extreme was considered quite a rare beauty. 4-inch feet were called silver lotuses. Pretty respectable, but nothing extraordinary. Anything above 5 inches was actually quite jokingly derided as an iron lotus, which sounds like a Chinese metal band, to be honest. Maybe it should be. Either way, it implied that the girl's feet were big and unrefined. Well, in social terms, these measures of foot size could also almost determine a woman's marriage prospects. Families with marriageable sons sought brides with the tiniest feet possible. A petite foot could literally serve as a form of, bridal currency of sorts in negotiating betrothals. I know it all sounds a bit weird, but in the marriage market of the late imperial Chinese period, a girl's foot size was very much as important as her dowry. The common saying, in fact, among matchmakers was, for every inch less in her feet, add an inch to the dowry. Smaller feet meant a higher value bride. But bound feet also became a marker of class. Originally a privilege of aristocratic ladies with leisure, the practice eventually filtered down, because every family aspired to climb that social ladder and wanted their daughters to have this mark of gentility. If a peasant family could afford to have the woman of the house bind their feet and thus limit their ability to do hard labor, it signaled that the family was doing well enough in financial terms. In this way, tiny feet came to embody status and respectability. A popular belief was that only a woman with bound feet could possess the poise, modesty, and graceful demeanor that was expected of a proper lady of high-born status. But conversely, women with natural, big feet were often labeled as peasants, unfeminine, and at the extreme end of things, even immoral. In fact, big-footed became a derogatory term for an unsophisticated woman. This social pressure ensured generation after generation of mothers felt compelled to bind their daughters' feet to secure them a good future. Very, poisonous kind of peer pressure, I suppose. Now, as one elderly Chinese woman, Zhuo Guizhen, later recalled with bitter clarity, at the time, if you didn't bind your feet, no one would marry you. That's a pretty stark ultimatum, isn't it? All provinces and centuries hearing that one and taking the precautions. Beyond status and marriageability, bound feet also carried a potent erotic and romantic fascination in Chinese culture. For many men of the scholar gentry class, who often left copious poetry and literature behind, the sight of a tiny swaying foot in a silk slipper was intensely alluring. Unlike in Western traditions, where other features were more sexualized, Chinese erotic aesthetics often focused on the feet. Paradoxically, the most erotic part was not seeing the foot uncovered, but rather it was the mystery and symbolism, the subtle way a woman minced along, her small steps making her hips and waist sway gently. That was considered irresistibly feminine. I suppose everyone has their own likes and dislikes. Poets wrote of a girl's Lotus gait, that is G-A-I-T, rather, praising how softly and slowly she would walk, almost as if she was floating through. A famous poetic image described a beautiful woman who, quote, when she walks, you can imagine a lotus blooming with each step. In private, a lover might lift the tiny embroidered shoe and catch a hint of the woman's natural scent mixed with perfume on the bound foot, an act that was loaded with sensual meaning. Bound feet were sometimes called fragrant archers, in fact, and romantic literature from the Ming and Qing eras is replete with rhapsodies about kissing a lover's delicate shoes or gently massaging her bound feet. One notorious 17th century novel, Jinping Mei, that is the plum in the golden vase in English, offers a window into this erotic imagination. The male protagonist is obsessed with his mistress's 3-inch lotus feet, finding them most arousing to him. So culturally, foot binding wasn't seen as merely a crippling deformity, even though it kind of was, but it was wrapped up in notions of desire, femininity, and even virtue of sorts. A well-bound foot indicated a woman was disciplined, obedient to her family and society's expectation, but also skilled in the womanly arts, since girls with bound feet often excelled in indoor pursuits, music, embroidery, fine needlework. In short, it was a symbol, not just of beauty, but also of a woman's character and obedience, I suppose. But at the same time, we have to note a kind of duality. Bound feet were fetishized, but they were also kept hidden. They were to be concealed within tiny slippers and ornate leggings. In public, a genteel woman never exposed her bound feet. Doing so would be as immodest as, I don't know, ripping one's shirt off in the middle of the supermarket. Even within the home, many husbands supposedly never saw their wives' bound feet unclothed. Only the wife's mother or female attendants handled the actual washing and wrapping. The secrecy around the bound foot added to its general mystique. It also meant that the tiny embroidered Lotus shoes became powerful fetish objects in themselves. And of course, these shoes, often just a few inches long, were crafted from fine brocade or silk with elaborate designs of flowers, birds, and auspicious symbols. Think of it as kind of like fancy lingerie, like how we have Victoria's Secret and the like in our modern era. That was how these little shoes were treated. Except, of course, you would wear them outside, too. Anyway, young women certainly prided themselves on sewing beautiful shoe designs. A bride's trousseau typically included many pairs of exquisite Lotus shoes that she had sewn and decorated. And that was another demonstration of her domestic skill and creativity. But let's get a little bit away from the romanticized Lotus foot, and let's look at how foot binding was actually done. And this is where, well, I suppose the fun never really started, but if the fun had started at all, this is certainly where it ends, this gruesome, painstaking, and lengthy process. It typically started when a girl was very young. How young? Well, around 5 to 8 years old. You see, at that age, the bones are still quite soft and malleable. The task usually fell to the child's mother or grandmother, who had themselves undergone the ordeal and sincerely believed what they were doing was best for the girl's future. Nevertheless, it was often an anguishing experience for both the child and the parent. Many memoirs recount the day of a girl's first binding as filled with tears and cries of pain, with the mother steeling herself to ignore those pleas, all for the sake of the daughter's long-term well-being. Now, think about it. I remember one time I went through some dental treatment. Not braces, but Invisalign. And, well, I wasn't crying and screaming the first couple of days, but I was certainly in quite a lot of discomfort. Having this foreign object in the mouth, these little buttons on your teeth and the plastic that goes around them. Terrible experience. Well, imagine that, but you don't get used to it. Well, perhaps the foot binding, of course, is a lot worse, but in trying to sympathize with the victims of this practice, I'm trying to find some kind of equivalent. Moving on. How exactly were the feet bound? Well, the procedure followed a pretty standard sequence across China, with a couple regional variations in technique, tightness, and timing. A typical binding session took place such as this. There'd be a few steps. First, there would be the soaking and softening. The girl's feet were first bathed in warm water or a mixture of herbs, sometimes animal blood, to soften the skin and tissues. Soaking also helped relax the foot, and was thought to be healthier and cleaner before binding. At this time, her toenails were trimmed extremely short, or sometimes entirely removed to prevent them from ingrowing or causing infection once the toes were pressed tight together. And I can already see you wincing at that prospect. While the foot was soft from soaking, the binder, whether a mother or an experienced professional, would curl the 4 small toes under toward the sole of the foot. One by one, each of the girl's toes except the big toe was forcefully broken or dislocated at the joint. This was, as you can imagine, quite excruciating. The toes were then pressed flat against the bottom of the foot, and the goal was that the arch and ball of the foot would eventually form a pointed shape, with the toes tucked underneath, creating a triangular or lily-bud form. Next came the most critical maneuver, bending the arch of the foot. The binder would push the foot's heel and sole together, essentially trying to fold the foot in half. Often, the arch of the foot would essentially snap or break during this bending, and in some cases, especially if the initial binding was done gradually, the arch might not break immediately, but would be severely strained and would fracture over time as the pressure continued. The aim of this was to make the front part of the foot with the toes meet the heel, eventually yielding that coveted 3-inch length. This step was when many girls would scream or faint from the pain. Families sometimes gave the child a mild sedative, or just had female relatives hold her down and soothe her with songs or stories to distract from the agony. Well, with the toes bent under and arch forced down, the foot was wrapped with a long strip of cloth. Typically, binding cloths were about 10 feet long and 2 inches wide, 3 meters and 5 centimeters, respectively. The binder would start at the instep and then wrap the cloth in a figure-8 pattern, pulling it tightly over the curled toes, around the heel, and then back over the foot, again and again. Each loop of cloth yanked the toes and ball of the foot closer to the heel. The motto was that tighter was better. The more pressure, the more the foot would deform into shape. This initial binding was done as tightly as the girl could bear, often until she was howling out for it to stop. The feet were then secured, and the child was made to get up and try to walk on them to further crush the arch. One common practice was to encourage or force the girl to walk back and forth on bound feet for a while, even though this was excruciating. That movement helped break the arch faster and loosen the joints. Foot binding was not a single event, but an ongoing process that lasted for years. Every day or two, the bindings had to be removed and retied. During unwrapping, the feet were cleaned and treated to prevent infection. Often the washing solution included herbs or alum to reduce odor and toughen the skin. Dead or rotting flesh would be trimmed off. And yeah, it was not uncommon for parts of the flesh, especially on the underside of the foot or between the crushed toes, to ulcerate and rot. In fact, we have a few accounts that mention that excess flesh was purposely allowed to rot away to make the foot smaller. The smell of bound feet, of course, was notorious. One writer frankly noted that a room could announce the presence of a foot-bound lady by a distinctive, pungent odor of sweat and decay. Mothers combated this by sprinkling talcum and fragrance. But it's often quite a losing battle. As the bindings were reapplied, they were pulled ever tighter, and often a new, smaller pair of shoes was introduced to continue shrinking the feet. Over time, the girl's toes would remain bent under permanently, the bones knitting in that position, and the arch would form a deep, concave curve. After about 2 years of constant binding, the ideal shape was achieved. The sole and the heel were almost touching, with a deep cleft between the heel and the ball of the foot. Legend says that this cleft could securely hold a pearl or coin. At that point, the foot was essentially set in its new form and could fit into the smallest final shoe. But even then, the bindings could never be fully taken off. They had to remain in place, at least loosely, for the rest of the woman's life, to keep the woman's foot from trying to straighten up and causing renewed pain, of course. Now that pain, it's certainly hard to overstate it. The process routinely led to blood, pus, and infections. And in many cases, if infections got bad, such as gangrene, the girls might even lose a toe. Or if sepsis spread, they could even die. Some historical reports claim that 10% or more girls did not survive the foot-binding years due to infections or other complications. Those who did survive had to endure a level of pain that is difficult to imagine, and that's day in, day out. One first-hand account from a woman with bound feet recalled how she cried every night for months. Her only comfort, the gentle nightly massage her mother would give her before rewrapping the bandages even tighter. As for the mothers, well, don't think of them all as so beastly. They were conflicted. They loved their daughters and hated to inflict pain. But because of this backwards culture, they firmly believed a daughter with natural feet would face a life of ridicule and a miserable marriage. Hard times, hard choices. It seems a world apart now, but it's all true. So, of course, they steeled themselves, wiping away their own tears as their daughters screamed for mercy. The daily life of a girl during these binding years was of course severely impacted. Often she could not walk unassisted. Girls crawled or were carried until they adjusted somewhat. Infection or injury might incapacitate them for days. Yet ironically, families sometimes intentionally made girls walk on their broken feet to hasten the shaping, literally crushing the arch under their weight. Neighbors could hear the girls' wails as they learned to hobble along, and in some wealthy families, professional foot-binders were hired, elderly women who specialized in coming to bind and rebind feet as tight as possible, sometimes using brute force that even a mother might shrink from replying. But despite all this torment, by adolescence, many girls adapted to their bound feet. The pain would dull after a few years, once the major bones had fractured and reformed. The result were feet that were permanently deformed. The 4 small toes folded under the foot, often to the point of disuse, and the big toe and heel forming the 2 ends of a shortened arc. An X-ray of a bound foot looks quite startling. The foot shape resembles a hook or a club. From the outside, when encased in a tiny shoe, the foot might still appear almost doll-like. But when unwrapped, the flesh was often pallid, with deep indentations from the cloth, and the toenails, if not removed, often grew in odd directions. Most women continue to have some pain, or at least tenderness, throughout their lives from their bound feet, especially if they had to stand or walk for long periods. They were also prone to falls. A bound foot woman's balance is quite precarious, since her weight rests mainly on the heels. In old age, many suffered hip and back problems from a lifetime of altered posture. Yet generation after generation, Millions of women went through this, upheld by the conviction that the beauty comes from the pain, and that a woman's duty was to endure this pain for the sake of her own prospects, but also the honor of her family. There was even a saying that a mother's love was shown by how well she bound her daughter's feet, counterintuitive and monstrous as it sounds. A mother who bound too loosely was considered to be neglectful, because her daughter's feet might end up big and ruin her marriage chances. So mothers took pride in producing a perfect pair of lotus feet. Family and friends would often gather to appraise a young lady's feet, praising a well-formed arch or tiny shoe. Girls, on their part, sometimes even developed a sense of pride in how small their feet were, despite all the suffering they went through. In later interviews, some foot-bound women recalled feeling a competitive spirit as teens. They wanted to have the smallest feet in the village. In that warped way, the pain was normalized. It became a rite of passage. Much as high heels causing blisters might be accepted by modern fashionistas, if infinitely it's not as extreme. Well, a well-bred girl might smile demurely and claim her feet didn't hurt, even if they did, to show a strong character. That endurance was a virtue cultivated by foot-binding, and it was often said that a woman who could endure the binding years could endure the hardships of marriage, childbirth, and servitude to in-laws. Thus, bound feet were training in discipline and obedience, the first grueling step in a pretty horrible life. Well, let's talk a little bit about the broader social ramifications. You see, the practice of foot binding had profound consequences for society and women's daily lives. On the most immediate level, it meant that virtually every woman of respectable class in late imperial China was living with a physical disability by design. Bound feet limited women's mobility in a drastic way. A woman with tiny lotus feet could not walk quickly, run, or jump. Her stride was shortened to perhaps a few inches per step. Going up and down stairs was difficult without support. Long-distance travel on foot? Well, pretty much impossible. This enforced a form of seclusion. Women literally stayed in place. It was just too hard to go anywhere. And that dovetailed with Confucian norms that a virtuous woman's place was in the home, not wandering around outside, and small feet certainly kept a woman inside the house, dependent on others to conduct outside business or even assist them physically. In rural areas, bound-foot women still participated in farm work, but their activities were limited to lighter tasks close to the home, like tending garden or feeding animals, rather than plowing fields or carrying heavy loads. Many women with bound feet focused on domestic crafts, embroidery, weaving, sewing, spinning, that kind of thing. And in fact, scholars have noted an important economic dimension here. Because bound feet kept girls and women seated in the home, they became a captive labor force for handicrafts. Families put them to work weaving cloth, making mats, or producing textiles, both for household use but also for sale. In regions of China that developed cottage industries, foot binding was especially prevalent. Now, when I say cottage industries, I mean, lace making, weaving, shoemaking, etc., things like this. Mothers needed their daughters to sit still for hours, and binding was one way to assure a flighty young girl was put at the spinning wheel. So from this perspective, bound feet were not merely about beauty, but also about economic productivity, within a certain traditional framework, of course. A recent anthropological study of foot binding even argues that the custom persisted so long partly because it enhanced a woman's work in handicraft. By immobilizing them, it trained them in fine manual labor that was economically valuable before industrialization. And I suppose there is a grim logic to it. Imagine if you broke your leg. You'd probably be spending quite a bit more time at home, wouldn't you? Hopefully engaged in productive pursuits. Perhaps you'd finish that little book you're working on. Perhaps I should finish mine. Good Lord. Well, surprisingly, foot-bound women were not entirely idle decorations. They're often very important workers in the domestic sphere, though their work was done in quite a bit of pain. But still, the social restrictions on the bound-foot woman were very significant. Education for girls was, unsurprisingly, not prioritized in imperial times, and foot-binding reinforced that. A bound-foot girl's curriculum was mostly learning domestic skills and maybe a little bit of poetry or literature, but that was only if she was of the upper elite class. And still, most of the time they didn't bother with that. Attending formal schools or roaming in intellectual circles was pretty much out of reach, both figuratively and literally. Furthermore, women with bound feet were largely excluded from public life. But there were exceptions. Some women with bound feet became writers, or even rebels. The famous Cho Jin, born in 1875, had bound feet in girlhood, but later defiantly unbound them as she joined revolutionary activities. One can hardly blame her, and good for her for being a trailblazer. But by and large, this wasn't the case. Foot binding symbolized and cemented a rather patriarchal order in which women were subordinated. It was said that with bound feet, a woman can also not wander off, meaning she would stay chaste and faithful. And indeed, some have theorized that one covert rationale for foot binding was to control women in that manner. A woman literally couldn't go far from her home or her husband, reducing any opportunities for infidelity. That being said, when there's a will, there's a way, and that goes for both men and women. But if she did try, she could be easily caught, since she moved so slowly. Certainly not ideal for the midnight rendezvous. And in such ways, bound feet served as a kind of physical restraint, almost like a ball and chain around the ankle. And then there's the health ramifications. Bound feet left women prone to injuries from falls, as we've said, and there is evidence that foot binding contributed to lifelong balance issues and weakened lower bodies. The muscles just don't work properly in those sorts of situations. In fact, one study found that older women who had been foot-bound had less stability and more difficulty raising from chairs, which likely contributed to earlier mortality in some cases. Surprisingly, they had to do a study to figure that out, but well, here we are. But aside from the direct foot trauma, the general confinement and inactivity might have affected women's overall health. Not just psychologically, but think about it. Less exercise, less fresh air. It's not good to be stuck in the house all the time. We all know that, especially after the events of the last 5 years. Oof, we don't want to talk about them. However, we shouldn't assume that bound-foot women were all completely bedridden and frail. That was not really the case. Many of them lived remarkably tough lives, despite their condition. There are even photographs from around 1900 showing peasant women with bound feet carrying heavy baskets or doing field work, sometimes using a stick for support and sometimes not. But either way, they certainly found ways to cope and contribute, pain notwithstanding. Socially, footbinding created a shared female experience that cut across generations. It was often said that footbinding formed a kind of bond between mother and daughter, albeit a bond in suffering. On one hand, this was a space of woman's authority. When it came to this ritual, the men were shooed away. Get out of here. This is our job. And there wasn't many spaces where that was happening in those times. Inside the women's quarters, elder women taught the young, passed on techniques for enduring pain, for making shoes and walking properly in bound feet. In a rigidly gender-segregated society, footbinding was part of a female cultural sphere. Women composed rhymes and songs about their bound feet, exchanged tips on comfort, and yes, sometimes even admired each other's feet. A mother might gently tease her daughter, saying that your feet are almost as pretty as mine were when I was your age. And in that sense, it was a tradition women themselves upheld with pride, as much as it was imposed upon them. But if you ask me, it all sounds like Stockholm Syndrome. The psychological ramifications could be severe. And there's no doubt, and I don't think we need to engage in too much imagination, that many girls felt a kind of trauma and even resentment. In fact, we have letters and oral histories where women recall begging their mothers to stop, only to be admonished that this was all for their own good. It instilled in many a deep sense of duty and sacrifice. A girl learned that her personal comfort was secondary to family honor or future marriage. This sense of sacrifice and endurance became ingrained. As adults, these women often proved remarkably stoic in the face of other hardships. But we can also imagine that being physically impaired influenced their personalities and relationships. For instance, women with bound feet often married into families where they would live with the husband's parents. Being unable to run away or be independent possibly made young brides more vulnerable to abuse from tyrannical in-laws. Some writings from late Qing reformers described foot-binding as keeping women in cages, rendering them helpless and at the mercy of their husbands' families. For many centuries, the practice was largely unquestioned and just accepted as a fact of life. However, that doesn't mean that there were no critics before modern times. Scattered voices did speak against it. As early as the 17th and 18th centuries, a few outspoken scholars and poets subtly criticized the practice. For example, Li Ruzhen, an innovative Qing Dynasty novelist, wrote a remarkable satirical story in 1827. In his novel, Flowers in the Mirror, he imagines a topsy-turvy country of women where gender roles are completely reversed, and the men in that land must bind their feet, wear dainty shoes, and even endure the pain of childbirth, while women were the ones in authority. By depicting men suffering, it kind of showed the absurdity of foot-binding. Li Ruzhen cleverly highlighted how cruel and arbitrary the custom was, and this satire suggested that foot-binding was not a divine mandate, but rather a man-made oppression that could well be otherwise. Other literati occasionally lamented the harm done to women. The famous poet Yuan Mei in the 18th century, who advocated for women's education, also disapproved of foot-binding, though quite gently. He loved women's natural beauty, and hinted that crippling their feet was a shame. These early internal critiques, however, had very little impact on society at large. Their voices largely lost in a wilderness of other literature. But once we get into the 19th century, when there was increased contact with the West and a general awakening to reform ideas, that is when footbinding came under serious attack. Western missionaries who arrived in China were universally horrified by the practice. They viewed it through a Christian humanitarian lens as a form of barbaric torture against girl children. Many wrote scathing depictions in their letters at home. One missionary in the 1840s described seeing a girl's unbound foot as, quote, a ghastly sight, the toes entirely bent under and bleeding. As Western influence grew after the Opium Wars, more foreigners encountered footbinding and publicized it internationally as an example of China's backwardness, or, quote, the plight of Chinese women. These depictions, while often a little bit self-righteous and sometimes sensationalized, did raise a bit of global awareness. By the late 1800s, Western women's groups were also rallying against footbinding as a kind of feminist cause. Some of the earliest transnational women's rights activism, by the way. But perhaps more crucially, Chinese reformers themselves began to link footbinding to national weakness. In the late Qing period, China suffered military defeats and internal crises, like the Taiping Rebellion, where notably the Taiping rebels outlawed footbinding in areas they controlled, calling for equality under Christian inspiration. Well, don't let that sound too good for you. The Taiping Rebellion was basically a man who thought he was the incarnation of Jesus Christ. And, well, it's a pretty long story. I did an old video on it, but I want to do a new one, and in greater detail, because, wow, it's just such a story to behold. I'll do one later. Leave me a comment if you want me to do one, actually. Yeah, I should do that. Anyway, reform-minded scholars and officials started asking questions. And one of the questions was this: how exactly can China strengthen itself if half of the population were literally crippled from childbirth? Good question. An influential essay in the 1880s by the scholar Xu Zhiyong argued that footbinding sapped the vitality of the race, and was one of the reasons why foreigners viewed China as weak and feeble. They used to use the term the sick man of Asia to refer to them. The logic was that binding made women unhealthy mothers, leading to weaker children, a kind of early eugenics argument. Others pointed out the simple fact that while Chinese women hobbled, foreign women could walk and work freely. Thus, to compete with the Western nations, China needed to liberate its women's feet. In fact, there was a popular saying that emerged under reformers: liberate the feet, liberate the nation. Women's bodies became a metaphor for the entire country. And in the 1890s, anti-footbinding societies began to form. The first known was the Heavenly Foot Society, founded in 1874 in the city of Xiamen by a British missionary, John McGowan, together with local Christian women. Now, at the time, Xiamen was known as Amoy. And by the way, if you do go to Xiamen, you owe it to yourself to visit a place called Gulangyu. It is an island that you take a ferry to about half an hour away. It's just beautiful, one of the most beautiful spots in China. You must go. I order it. Okay. Well, anyway, this John McGowan, with the local Christian women, founded the organization, and it convinced a few dozen mothers to pledge not to bind their daughters' feet. And at the time, that was a rather radical decision. This small start spread to other mission centers, and by 1895, a larger natural foot society was organized in Shanghai. notably led by Western-educated Chinese and some missionary wives like Alicia Little. These societies use pamphlets, public lectures, and pledges to promote natural and unbound feet. They had Chinese members make public vows. Men would not marry women with bound feet, and women would not bind their daughters. Now, this two-pronged pledge was pretty clever when you think about it. It tried to break the marriage market incentive for binding. Newspapers in treaty port cities carried debates about foot binding, often framing it as a struggle between civilization and feudalism. An editorial from the era called foot binding, quote, a millstone around the neck of China that had to be shed if China hoped to modernize. As for the imperial court, they initially hesitated to intervene with such an entrenched private custom, but eventually, even the Dowager Empress Cixi was convinced, or perhaps pressured, to act. Either way, it's the kind of pressure that you want, right? Not the other pressure of the feet. And so, in 1902, an imperial edict was issued declaring foot binding illegal in the Qing Empire. And that was an astonishing moment. After roughly 1,000 years, the highest authorities said no more. And of course, laws on paper didn't automatically change the minds on the ground, especially since most of the population was rural and, well, it's a little bit Wild West out there. Many people, especially in the conservative rural communities, simply ignored the ban and just continued it in secret. However, the edict did empower local officials and anti-foot binding leagues to step up their campaigns. Schools for girls, another new phenomenon in the early 1900s, often required students to have natural feet, forcing some parents to unbind their young daughters if they wanted them educated. Chinese feminists and revolutionaries also took up the cause. Figures like Qiu Jin, which we've discussed before, she's often called China's first feminist, by the way, spoke passionately against foot binding. Qiu Jin herself had her feet bound as a child, but as a young adult around 1903 she dramatically removed the bindings and let her feet grow, though by then they were damaged quite beyond repair and never returned to their full size. She wrote essays urging women to cast off this legacy of oppression and to educate and empower themselves. To Qiu Jin and her compatriots in the early 20th century, bound feet symbolized everything that was holding China's women back. Ignorance, subservience, pain, seclusion. Freeing the feet was the first step to freeing the mind and body of the Chinese women. After the Qing Dynasty fell in 1911 and the Republic of China was founded, the new government reaffirmed the ban on foot binding. Leaders of the Republic saw themselves as modernizers of sorts, and they rigorously promoted a slogan of "Heaven bestows no foot bindings" in their legal code. In some areas, local warlords or officials enforced anti-foot binding rules by sending inspectors to villages. These inspectors would check young girls' feet and even forcibly cut bindings or fine families. In fact, one woman from Yunnan in the 1910s remembered how her mother tricked the inspectors by wrapping her feet in big shoes to hide the fact they were still bound, an example of the cat-and-mouse game between tradition and law, I suppose. But over time, however, the social tide truly turned. By the 1910s and 1920s, among urban populations, bound feet were increasingly seen as old-fashioned, or even embarrassing. A modern girl wanted to have natural feet, as a sign of being enlightened and modernized. The cities led, and the rural areas followed more slowly. And by the 1930s, foot binding was rapidly vanishing. though one could still find teenagers with bound feet in some isolated districts. Some families in remote village continued binding in secret, away from the prying eyes. But the practice was clearly on the decline. Now, when the communist government came to power in 1949, they enforced prohibition absolutely wherever in any lingering cases was found. The communists, as part of sweeping social reforms, condemned footbinding as one of the cruel, feudal traditions that had to be abolished, often touting that as one of their early successes in women's liberation. Health workers were sent to educate and assist women in unbinding their feet if any were still doing it. Essentially, by around 1950, no new foot bindings were being started anywhere in China. But it is important to recognize that the end of foot binding was not just due to government bans. It was because cultural perceptions had fundamentally changed. What was once revered as beautiful had come to be seen almost overnight in historical terms as ugly and backwards and even shameful, a symbol of the old China. And the old China was weak. The old China was humiliated. The new China was strong. And to build a strong new country, they needed women too, who were healthy and mobile, not just hobbling around on tiny feet. The discourse around foot binding thus changed from reverence to ridicule. A folk adage emerged in the 20th century, small-footed mothers, big-footed daughters, reflecting the pride that the new generation had unbound feet and a completely new look. And of course, we think of the quote from Mao Zedong, Chairman Mao Zedong, women hold up half of the sky. Of course, you can't have a new China with half the population stuck in the home. Everyone needs to do their bit. And so, as we've mentioned, the final unbinding is quite a dramatic chapter in itself. The official bans came in 1902, reinforced in 1912, but enforcement varied. In some cities like Shanghai and Guangzhou, footbinding almost disappeared by the 1920s, simply because urban society shunned it. But in the more rural areas, the transition was slower, sometimes even surreptitious. Some families compromised somewhat by binding their daughters' feet loosely, so they could claim that they weren't binding, but they were just hoping to shape the feet a little bit. I'm sure no one really believed that excuse, but others hid the practice entirely. In fact, there were instances during the warlord era, 1916 to 28, where local powers turned a blind eye to foot binding and saw slight revivals in communities not reached by the new education of the new reforms. However, the communists were the fatal blow to the practice. They saw themselves as liberators of women, and we already mentioned that quote from Mao Zedong, and that was part of a vision that women would fully participate in work and society, and that's impossible with bound feet. So the new government sent out everyone to educate them. In the early 50s, there are accounts of officials literally cutting off the bindings of some elderly woman to force them to unbind, though one imagines these poor women's feet unwrapped after decades would have been both terribly painful and weak. Perhaps that's a bit of an oversight on these new reformers' behalves. But essentially the practice was stamped out, so much that by the late 20th century many young Chinese women had only heard of foot binding through their grandmother's stories or their history books. One of the last generational cohorts to experience foot binding were those born in the 20s and 30s, remote areas who got bound as toddlers before the practice truly ended. These women were in their 70s and 80s by the turn of the 21st century, and as of today, there's only a handful of very elderly women, well and truly into their 90s, who still have bound feet, living relics of a bygone custom. In fact, in the 2000s, journalists and researchers rushed to document their stories before they passed away. Some of these women expressed conflicting feelings. A number said they regretted having their feet bound, knowing now it was just unnecessary suffering. For example, Zhou Guizhen, whom we met earlier, said in old age, "I can't dance. I can't move properly. I regret it a lot." Yet, in the same breath, she reflected that in her youth, bound feet were simply the only way. Social death awaited an unbound girl. Others of her contemporaries took a sort of stubborn pride in the tiny feet. A 90-year-old in rural Yunnan smiled and boasted, "It's not a single other woman in this area who could fit into my shoes." Weird flex, but okay. Well, that pride shows the lingering internalized value. A lifetime of identity, wrapped up, literally, in those bindings is not easy to cast aside, even when society has moved on. Old habits die hard. Now, before we finish up, here's an interesting postscript. Some of these last bound feet women found new roles in the modern era. In the early 1990s, a group of elderly women in China formed a bound feet women's dance troupe. Yes, not joking. They creatively turned what was once a stigma into a kind of performance art. These grandmothers would put on their old-style outfits and tiny shoes to perform traditional dances, including curious tourists, of course. They became minor local celebrities. One of them in their 80s reminisced how she never imagined people would one day applaud her for the very feet she used to hide. However, it is of course a little controversial. Some people felt it was quite exploitative, a kind of freak show to capitalize on these women's deformities. Local media debated if the troupe was really celebrating cultural heritage or just commodifying past cruelty. But the women themselves seemed to enjoy the attention, not to mention the extra income, perhaps even a sense of camaraderie. Either way, the scenario shows the complicated legacy of footbinding, reviled in principle. But in practice, these women took ownership over their narrative in their twilight years. Perhaps that's one way of gaining power back. Anyway, that's all we have today for footbinding. Not sure if you enjoyed that video. It's not the most pleasant topic, but it's one of those forgotten little eccentricities that doesn't really get talked about as often as it should. Anyway, let me thank my top-tier patrons: Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Legitmus, Gary, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfidnir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuronerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stephen, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Towry, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Neftis, Alexander, Gurkhan, Dorsey, Vanita, Claire, Cortesi, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, and Nefertari. Wow. Thank you very much for joining me today, and I will see you in the next video. Lots of love to you all. Good night and farewell for now.